Happy Halloween, mortals. Tonight, another one of our October specials as we step into a labyrinth of shadows across a century of haunted attractions. A journey from playful disorientation to blood-stained tragedy, from engineered nightmares to real human suffering. Haunted houses aren't just rides. They are experiments in fear. Sometimes they entertain, sometimes they kill, and sometimes they don't let you go.
Chapter 1. The Haunted Swing. Vienna's Prater Park, Vienna, 1894. A city of music, elegance, and invention. The waltz drifted through gilded dance halls. Freud was beginning to map the inner mind. Electricity had started to glow on city streets. And in the Prater amusement park, something far stranger was unveiled. An attraction that made the ground beneath your feet betray you. It was called the Haunted Swing. From the outside, it looked harmless enough. A large wooden chamber with benches where visitors could sit and sway. The promise was simple. A playful illusion, a mild sensation of swinging. But once the door shut and the mechanism engaged, the trick revealed itself. The swing barely moved. Instead, the entire room rotated on a hidden pivot. Walls became ceilings. Ceilings became floors. A chandelier dripped candle wax sideways. Chairs clung to walls like they had been nailed there by unseen hands. The body swore gravity had turned against it. Newspapers struggled to describe the experience. Madness in motion, one headline declared. A Viennese critic wrote that visitors emerged pale and gasping, as if they had passed through delirium itself. Women fainted. Men staggered out, clutching the walls for support. Children screamed until attendants rushed them into the open air. Doctors warned that the ride might trigger seizures or hysteria. One report claimed a young woman believed she had been rotated so violently her insides had shifted. A boy was said to cry for hours, convinced he would never walk upright again. The clergy condemned it outright. Priests declared that the haunted swing mocked God's order of creation, replacing divine stability with man-made chaos. To them, this was no carnival trick, but an affront to heaven itself. Yet that condemnation only fueled the attraction's allure. To the curious and the daring, the haunted swing became a test of nerves, a safe glimpse into madness. It was the thrill of losing control while still believing you were safe. And in its success, it planted the seed of an entirely new form of amusement. This was not theater where the audience knew it was watching a story. This was not a magic act where trickery was performed at a distance. The haunted swing trapped its guests inside the illusion, made them the victims of the trick. Its popularity spread across Europe. Copycats appeared in Paris, Berlin, London. By the early 20th century, variations of the ride had reached America. Funhouses adopted its principle of engineered disorientation, building crooked rooms and shifting floors to extend the sensation of a world out of balance. Even today, descendants of the haunted swing still exist, quietly tucked into old fairgrounds, still capable of making riders stumble like drunks. Looking back, the haunted swing seems almost innocent compared to the blood-soaked horrors that would follow in haunted house history. No corpses, no gore, no demons, and yet it may have been the most honest expression of fear ever engineered. Not the fear of monsters, but the fear of losing reality itself. In 1894, the world's first haunted attraction didn't need skeletons or chains. It only needed to flip the world upside down and refuse to put it back again. Chapter 2. Horror House, Earl's Court, London, 1915. The world was at war. While young men bled in the trenches of France, the streets of London carried on with an eerie determination. Amid ration lines and air raid sirens, the Earl's Court exhibition grounds offered distraction, music halls, rides, and mechanical wonders. But among the bright lights stood something darker, a building known only as the Horror House. This was the world's first permanent haunted house attraction. Not a carnival sideshow, not a temporary illusion, but a full-scale walk-through experience that dared to turn death into spectacle. Inside, visitors passed through narrow corridors into chambers where horror waited. Wax corpses sprawled on blood-stained tables. Severed heads stared blankly from shelves. Mock morgues displayed bodies mid-autopsy, knives frozen mid-incision. Each room offered a new tableau of decay. But the most infamous chamber was reserved for London's darkest legend, Jack the Ripper. The killer's shadow loomed in a foggy alley, knife in hand, while his victims were posed in grotesque positions. One figure lay sprawled in a bed, another slumped against a wall, throat gaping open. For the public, it was a chance to walk straight into the nightmare that had haunted the city's streets less than 30 years earlier. The effect was staggering. Newspapers described women fainting, men emerging pale like soldiers from a gas attack. One critic derided the exhibition as a morgue for entertainment. Another called it a cathedral to cruelty. Yet, for every moral outcry, the lines outside grew longer. Why? Because in a world where death was real and constant, the horror house offered a twisted comfort. Here, death could be stared at, confronted, and escaped. For the cost of a ticket, Londoners stepped into a nightmare and walked out alive. Unlike the bombs that fell from the sky, these horrors followed a script. The attraction was also groundbreaking in its design. It didn't just rely on static displays. Themed rooms escalated the terror step by step, teaching future designers how to pace fear. Shadows flickered under dim lamps. Recorded screams and mechanical groans created a soundscape of dread. Visitors weren't simply looking at horrors, they were walking through them. The template for every haunted attraction that followed was born here, in Earl's Court. But its existence was controversial. Religious leaders condemned it as blasphemy, declaring that no decent Christian should pay to stroll among corpses. Social critics argued that reenacting Jack the Ripper's murders for fun trivialized the suffering of real women. Some were disturbed by the parallels between the wax corpses of Earl's Court and the very real bodies filling military hospitals across Europe. And yet, the attraction thrived. Its very controversy fueled its allure. Patrons bragged about enduring it, the way soldiers bragged about surviving bombardments. The horror house became a rite of passage, proof that one could face darkness and emerge unbroken. In time, the wax melted, the sets dismantled. The horror house was lost to history, but its shadow remained. It showed that haunted attractions could be more than cheap tricks. They could be immersive, narrative-driven environments designed to scar memory itself. Every haunted house that came after, from carnival dark rides to extreme survival horror, owes something to Earl's Court. It was there in 1915 that death itself was first sold as a ticketed attraction. And if the horror house blurred the line between the fake and the real, the rides that followed would obliterate it, because sometimes the corpses on display weren't wax at all. Chapter 3, Laff in the Dark, and Elmer McCurdy, Coney Island, 1920s to 1970s. For decades, it was America's playground, a carnival city on the edge of the Atlantic, where neon lights burned late into the night, and every alley hid another wonder, another trick. Among the roller coasters and Ferris wheels, one attraction reigned as the very essence of carnival horror: the dark ride. Dark rides were the evolution of the haunted swing. Instead of simply flipping the world upside down, they carried riders into painted nightmares. Slow-moving carts rattling through corridors, where skeletons lunged, witches cackled, and grotesque figures popped from shadows. They were crude, jerky, and often laughable, which is exactly how one of the most infamous rides of all time earned its name: Laff in the Dark. From the outside, it promised goofy frights, clowns with bulbous noses, papier-mâché monsters, jarring horns, and clashing cymbals. It was meant to be more silly than terrifying. But inside, in the dark, surrounded by the smell of ozone, grease, and mildew, the laughter quickly curdled into unease. The cars rattled past dismembered mannequins, heads swinging on springs, skeletons dangling from nooses, and painted demons that leapt forward with sudden bursts of light. Children screamed and laughed. Adults shook their heads, muttering it was cheap junk. But everyone agreed. Something about Laff in the dark didn't feel right. And there was a reason. Because for decades, inside this ride, one of the attractions wasn't made of wood, plaster, or wax. It was flesh. Real flesh. The outlaw who wouldn't stay dead. The story begins not at Coney Island, but in the dusty Badlands of Oklahoma, 1911. There, a small-time outlaw named Elmer McCurdy made a career out of failure. He bungled robberies, botched train heists, and died in a shootout at just 31 years old. His body was embalmed by a local undertaker who used an especially strong preservative. So strong that McCurdy's remains hardened like leather. No family came to claim him, so the undertaker put the corpse on display in the funeral parlor, charging 5 cents to see the bandit who wouldn't give up. Visitors dropped coins into his open mouth, marveling at the lifelike mummy. For years, Elmer drew crowds. Carnivals began to rent him as a sideshow exhibit. His mummified body passed from one showman to another, traded like property, each claiming him as a curiosity. By the 1930s, McCurdy was on the carnival circuit. By the 1960s, he was considered little more than a prop, so shriveled and painted that few realized he was once human. The hanging man of Coney Island. Somehow, through decades of sales and trades, McCurdy's body ended up in Laff in the dark, hung from a gallows in the shadows of the ride, painted in fluorescent colors, his jaw slack, his limbs stiff. Most visitors thought he was a mannequin, just another cheap prop in a cheap attraction. Children remembered tugging at their parents' sleeves, whispering that the hanging man looked too real. Adults laughed it off, but the unease remained. 1976. The discovery. Then came 1976. Television crews were filming an episode of The $6 Million Man inside the funhouse. While preparing a shot, a crew member reached for the hanging man to reposition him. As he moved the figure, the arm snapped off at the shoulder, and inside, instead of splintered wood or rusted wire, there was bone. Real, human bone. The ride was shut down immediately. Police swarmed the funhouse. The body was sent to a coroner who confirmed it was genuine. When they scraped away the paint, the tattoos and embalming chemicals told the rest of the story. This was Elmer McCurdy, the outlaw who had been dead for 65 years but somehow lived on as a carnival ghoul. Shock and scandal. The headlines were surreal. Funhouse corpse was real outlaw. Mannequin was a mummy. Former visitors came forward in horror. One woman recalled riding Laff in the dark as a teenager. We always joked that the hanging man looked too good. Now I can't stop thinking, I laughed at a dead man. Another patron claimed the figure's hollow eyes haunted his dreams for years, long before the truth came out. Parents were outraged. Lawsuits followed, accusing the carnival industry of reckless disregard for human dignity. How had no one questioned the authenticity of the corpse for decades? And yet within the outrage was fascination. Elmer McCurdy became a posthumous celebrity. His life as a failed outlaw was eclipsed by his second, far stranger career as the most infamous carnival prop of all time. The aftermath. In 1977, McCurdy was finally laid to rest in Guthrie, Oklahoma. His grave was covered with 2 feet of concrete to prevent him from ever being stolen again. At the funeral, townspeople gathered as if attending the burial of a folk hero. A preacher declared, "This man has traveled farther in death than most men do in life." But the scandal had lasting effects. Amusement parks began auditing their attractions more carefully, making sure every skeleton and corpse on display was rubber, plastic, or resin. The line between fake and real had been crossed once, and the industry knew it could never allow it to happen again. The legacy of Laff in the dark. Laff in the dark became infamous. Scholars point to it as the moment haunted attractions truly lost their innocence. What had once been silly diversions of papier-mâché clowns and rubber skeletons became freighted with the possibility of something more sinister. Even today, visitors to Coney Island recall the ride's peculiar aura, that mix of mildew, grease, and genuine dread. Some swore they always sensed something wrong in that room with the hanging man. Others say the discovery transformed every funhouse forever. Because after Elmer McCurdy, patrons could no longer be certain that the horrors they were seeing were fake. Chapter 4. Castle Dracula, Wildwood, New Jersey, 1977 to 2002. By the late 1970s, the New Jersey boardwalk was a kingdom of noise. Arcades blared with pinball bells. Surf music drifted from jukeboxes. The smell of saltwater taffy clung to the night air. Families packed the piers, chasing thrills on spinning rides and roller coasters. And then, rising above it all like a black fortress against the Atlantic sky, there was Castle Dracula. Unlike the plywood facades of most haunted attractions, Castle Dracula was monumental. 2 towers rose high above the boardwalk, stonework painted in soot dark gray, torches flickering at its gates. Gargoyles stared down at the crowds. To children, it looked alive. To parents, it was both a lure and a dare. When you crossed its drawbridge, you stepped out of Wildwood's carnival chaos and into another world. Inside, Castle Dracula was more than a haunted house. It was an empire of fear, sprawling through chambers, dungeons, and winding staircases. The tour of terror visitors passed through torture chambers, where animatronic prisoners writhed in iron maidens. Guillotines dropped with sickening cracks. Wax nobles were impaled on stakes, their screams looped on hidden speakers. Smoke machines filled execution halls with choking fog. In the banquet room, skeletal kings and queens raised goblets in eternal toast, their jaws clattering as if laughing at the living. In the crypts, coffins rattled and lids slammed open to reveal corpses that lunged from the dark. Unlike smaller haunted houses, Castle Dracula didn't rush its audience. It swallowed them. Guests wandered room after room, climbing creaking staircases, brushing past dangling chains, and peering into dungeons where the tortured seemed to breathe. Actors in makeup stalked the corridors, breaking the predictability of mechanical scares. One moment it was jerky animatronics. The next, a bloodied executioner breathing down your neck. For children, it was unforgettable. For some, it was too much. Tears, screams, and early exits. But for everyone, it was an initiation. Childhood nightmares. Ask anyone who grew up in New Jersey in the 80s or 90s, and they'll tell you, Castle Dracula was a rite of passage. Kids dared each other to enter, swearing they'd survive the dungeon. Parents promised it was just a ride, only to admit later that they too were unnerved by the castle's uncanny atmosphere. One local recalled, "The castle terrified me more than any movie. You could smell it, dust, mildew, the fog machines, and it felt endless, like you'd never find your way out." Another remembered standing on the drawbridge, frozen, until friends dragged him inside. The legend of the castle was passed through generations, older siblings warning the younger ones, teens boasting of conquering it, families making it a summer tradition. Haunted by more than actors. But what set Castle Dracula apart wasn't just its spectacle. It was the feeling that something inside wasn't staged. Employees told stories of strange happenings when the attraction was closed. Locked doors opened on their own. Mannequins seemed to shift position overnight. Tools went missing, only to be found in sealed rooms. Some swore they heard whispers when the castle was empty, or footsteps echoing in halls long after closing time. One actor remembered hiding in a corridor, waiting to scare a guest, when he suddenly felt a cold hand brush his arm. No one was there. Another claimed he quit after seeing a figure in monk's robes glide through a locked stairwell. The curse became part of the marketing. Locals told newcomers that Castle Dracula wasn't just haunted, it was haunted. The fire of 2002. Then came August 2002. On a hot summer night, flames tore through the castle. Locals watched in disbelief as smoke poured into the sky, glowing red against the boardwalk lights. Firefighters rushed to the scene, but the building was a labyrinth. Stone towers, hidden corridors, secret stairwells. It was impossible to save. By dawn, Castle Dracula was reduced to a charred skeleton. The cause was ruled accidental. Investigators suspected welding sparks from nearby construction, but rumors spread immediately. Some swore it was arson. Others whispered that the curse had finally claimed its prize. For Wildwood, the site was apocalyptic. Children clutched their parents and cried. Adults stood silently watching the fortress collapse. One newspaper headline read, "The boardwalk's dark heart reduced to ash." Mourning a monster. In the days after the fire, the ruins became a shrine. Crowds gathered to take photos. Former employees wept. Families swapped stories of their first terrifying walk through the castle's halls. Some said they could still smell the fog machine's mist on the night air. Letters poured into local papers. We didn't just lose a building. We lost our childhood. Another wrote, Castle Dracula was more than an attraction. It was the boardwalk's soul for Wildwood. The loss was cultural. Castle Dracula had defined summers for 25 years. It was a symbol, a rite of passage, and a legend. Its absence left a void no ride could fill. The legacy today, Castle Dracula survives only in memory and fragments. Photos of its facades circulate online, stirring both nostalgia and chills. Documentaries about Wildwood always pause to show the towers that once rose over the pier. Haunted attraction fans rank it among the most legendary haunts ever built. Former employees still swap stories about the real hauntings. Guests remember the smell, the sound, the dread of climbing its endless staircases. Parents tell their children about the castle that once stood where the rides now spin. Its destruction only cemented its place in history. Haunted houses are meant to be illusions, temporary escapes. But Castle Dracula proved something darker. Sometimes even the strongest illusions burn. And when they do, they leave behind not emptiness, but a ghost. For Wildwood, Castle Dracula is still there, towering not on the pier, but in memory. A fortress where nightmares lived, laughter turned to screams, and generations learned what it meant to be afraid. Chapter 5. The Six Flags. Haunted Castle Fire, 1984. By the early 1980s, haunted attractions were booming. No longer just funhouses or sideshow novelties, they were sprawling productions built to terrify teenagers hungry for cheap thrills. At Six Flags, Great Adventure in Jackson Township, New Jersey, one such attraction stood at the edge of the park, the Haunted Castle. It was a maze of narrow corridors and darkened rooms, cobbled together from a series of interconnected trailers disguised behind a castle-like facade. Inside, actors in rubber masks leapt from shadows. Animatronic monsters twitched and groaned. Fog machines choked the air. It wasn't elegant, but it was popular. For a couple of dollars, kids could stumble through its pitch-black halls, screaming, laughing, and daring each other to survive. But beneath the screams was a silent danger. May 11th, 1984. It was a warm Friday night, the start of the summer season. Teenagers crowded the park, spilling Coke and popcorn on the midway. The haunted castle, as usual, had a line. Among those waiting were 8 friends, all between 15 and 19 years old. They wanted to be scared. What they didn't know was that they were walking into the deadliest haunted attraction in history. At 6:35 p.m., Smoke began to seep through the halls. Accounts differ on exactly how it started. Some say a lighter accidentally set foam padding ablaze, others that a careless guest flicked a cigarette. But in a maze made of wood, tar paper, and polyurethane foam, a spark was all it took. Within minutes, the interior was an inferno. Trapped inside the haunted castle was a labyrinth of twisting corridors, most unlit except by the occasional strobe. When the fire broke out, visitors had no idea what was happening. Some thought the smoke and heat were part of the show. By the time they realized it wasn't, the exit was already cut off. Those who survived described stumbling in pitch black halls, coughing, clawing at the walls for a way out. Some smashed through emergency doors, others trampled over props and fled into the night air. But for 8 teenagers, the fire was inescapable. The smoke grew too thick, the flames too fast. They were trapped deep inside the maze, lost in corridors designed to confuse. When firefighters entered the wreckage, they found the bodies huddled together, overcome by smoke and flame. 8 lives lost in a building meant to deliver only make-believe fear. The horror aftermath. News of the fire spread instantly. Parents rushed to the park, desperate for answers. Reporters broadcast footage of the smoldering wreckage, the castle's stone facade still standing while its insides glowed with embers. The names of the dead filled newspapers. Teenagers who had gone out for a night of fun, only to never return. The public was horrified. Haunted houses were supposed to scare you, but not kill you. The investigation. The investigation revealed shocking truths. The haunted castle had no sprinklers, no smoke detectors, no alarms. The walls were lined with flammable foam padding. The trailers had no permanent foundation, and yet the attraction was treated as a temporary structure, exempt from the stricter building codes applied to permanent buildings. Safety officials had warned of the risks for years, but nothing had been done. Six Flags claimed the fire was unforeseeable. Families of the victims claimed negligence. The trial that followed charged the park and its parent company with aggravated manslaughter. Prosecutors argued that Six Flags had knowingly operated a death trap, putting profit over safety. Defense attorneys insisted the fire was an unforeseeable accident. In 1985, after a long trial, Six Flags was acquitted. No one went to prison for the 8 deaths, but the damage was already done, changing the industry. The haunted castle fire shocked the amusement industry into action. Across the United States, haunted houses were suddenly inspected, regulated, and in some cases shut down. Fire codes were rewritten. Attractions were forced to install sprinklers, alarms, and emergency lighting. For the first time, lawmakers recognized that haunted houses weren't just games of fright. They were real buildings where real lives could be lost. To this day, the haunted castle fire remains one of the deadliest amusement park disasters in American history. Haunted legacy. Locals still remember the night the castle burned. Some who survived the fire swear. They can still hear the screams when they close their eyes. The site where the attraction once stood is quiet now, swallowed by new rides. But those who know the story never forget. The haunted castle was supposed to make you scream, then laugh, then walk away. Instead, it delivered real horror. It turned a carnival scare into tragedy. Haunted houses are supposed to end with relief. The exit sign, the sunlight, the laughter of friends who made it through. But on May 11th, 1984, the haunted castle ended with smoke, silence, and 8 bodies that never made it out. It was the moment haunted houses crossed from illusion into reality. A reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't actors or props. They're negligence, greed, and the fire waiting in the walls. Chapter 6. Spookorama. Coney Island, 1955 to present. Coney Island in the 1950s was a fated kingdom. Once the glittering heart of American amusement, it had begun to fray around the edges. Paint peeled from rides, midways grew shabby. But amid the decline one attraction rose from the dust and refused to die. Spookorama. Built in 1955 at Deno's Wonderwheel Park, Spookorama was billed as the world's longest dark ride. From the start, it promised more than just a cheap fright. It promised immersion. Riders boarded clattering cars shaped like coffins and were swallowed by blackness. Inside, the world twisted into madness. The ride. Unlike the more cartoonish funhouses of its era, Spookorama embraced grotesquerie. Animatronic ghouls jerked forward on rusted gears, their eyes bulging under blacklight. Skeletons leapt from coffins with snapping jaws. Giant rats scurried across tracks, their fur mangy with age. The soundtrack was a chaos of shrieks, clanks, and distorted carnival music. Strobe lights disoriented riders, making shadows stretch unnaturally long. The smell was unforgettable. A mix of grease, dust, and mold. For children, it was overwhelming. Many emerged in tears. Some swore they'd never ride again. And yet, year after year, families returned, dragging new generations into its haunted maw. Nightmares that lasted. The psychological impact of Spookorama was legendary. Parents joked about kids wetting themselves inside. Teenagers dared each other to keep their eyes open through the whole ride. But beneath the laughter, there was genuine trauma. Local newspapers ran stories of children who had nightmares for weeks after visiting. One mother recalled her son waking up screaming that, "The skeleton is still in my room." Another swore her daughter wouldn't sleep without the lights on for months. Unlike polished theme parks, Spookorama felt dangerous. The ride cars rattled violently. Sparks flew from ancient wiring. Animatronics, with their jerky movements and grotesque faces, often looked more like corpses than props. Riders weren't sure if what they were seeing was intentional, or if the ride itself was falling apart around them. That uncertainty became part of the fear. Survival through decay. Over the decades, Spookorama changed. Some of the original scenes were updated, others abandoned. Animatronics rusted in place, their movements slowing until they seemed more like corpses rotting than monsters lunging. Paint peeled, rubber faces sagged. But instead of ruining the illusion, the decay deepened it. By the 1980s, Spookorama felt less like a carnival attraction and more like a time capsule of nightmares. Parents who rode it as children brought their kids, whispering, "It's scarier now." The groans of the machinery, the rust on the tracks, the flickering lights, everything that might have been a flaw in another ride became part of Spookorama's terror. A living relic. As Coney Island itself declined through the 20th century, Spookorama endured. When roller coasters were torn down, when arcades shuttered, when entire parks closed, Spookorama kept running. It became more than just an attraction. It became a symbol, a survivor, the last gasp of a kind of haunted house that refused to modernize, that relied not on polish, but on raw, unsettling imperfection. For horror fans, that made it sacred. Voices of the boardwalk generations of New Yorkers carry Spookorama in their memory like a scar. One man recalled, "My father took me on Spookorama when I was 6. I cried so hard, the operator stopped the ride halfway through. The next year he made me try again." That became our tradition, conquering it, then riding the Wonder Wheel to calm down. A woman remembered her teenage years in the 70s. We'd pile into the cars 3 at a time, screaming, pretending not to be scared. But it wasn't pretend. That place got under your skin. The smell, the sounds, you never forgot them. Even those who hated it admit it shaped them. One parent confessed, "I swore I'd never put my kids through it. And yet, when they were old enough, I did. Because that's what you do. You pass the fear down. urban legends. Of course, with an attraction, this old urban legends grew. Some said a real skeleton was hidden among the animatronics, left over from the 1950s. Others claimed employees sometimes dressed as monsters and jumped into the cars mid-ride, vanishing again into the dark. There were even whispers of accidents, a rider falling from a car, a worker electrocuted in the wiring, a lost child wandering the track and never found. None of these stories were ever proven, but they clung to the ride like mildew. Spookorama didn't just scare with rubber ghouls. It scared with possibility. The possibility that behind the laughter, something truly awful might be waiting, still running. And somehow, against all odds, Spookorama is still running. Today, more than 60 years after it first opened, it continues to rattle and creak along the boardwalk. Modern visitors often describe it as both cheesy and terrifying. Its animatronics are antiques, its scares predictable, but the age itself is the horror. To ride Spookorama is to enter a relic that feels barely held together, a museum of fear where the dust is as much a character as the monsters. Parents still drag their children inside, teenagers still dare each other to go, and every year, another generation emerges, shaken, laughing, swearing they'll never do it again. Legacy Spookorama may never make headlines the way Elmer McCurdy did. It never burned like Castle Dracula. It never killed like Six Flags Haunted Castle. But it represents something rarer: endurance. It has outlived wars, recessions, and even Coney Island's near collapse. And in its rust and decay, it has grown more terrifying than when it was new. Because horror doesn't always come from polish or technology. Sometimes it comes from the creak of rusted gears, the stench of mildew, and the knowledge that the monster lurching toward you has been doing so for 70 years. Spookorama is proof that the scariest things aren't always new. They're the ones that refuse to die. And as Spookorama rattles on, preserved by rust and memory, it serves as a reminder of what horror once was. Crude, imperfect, and unforgettable. A carnival relic that still reaches into the dark corners of the mind, preparing us for the next evolution of fear. One that would be designed not just to startle us, but to wound us. Chapter 7. Hell Houses, 1980s to present. By the 1980s, haunted houses in America had split into two traditions. On one side were the carnival dark rides and theme park attractions, designed to make you laugh, scream, and come out the other side intact. On the other side, in the basements of churches and gymnasiums of evangelical congregations, a different kind of haunted house was being born. They were called hell houses. Origins. The first hell houses appeared in evangelical churches across the American South and Midwest. Pastors saw Halloween not as a harmless holiday, but as a pagan celebration that glorified sin. So they created their own haunted attractions, ones that wouldn't just scare audiences, but terrify them into religious obedience. Instead of skeletons and vampires, hell houses featured scenes of abortion, drug use, suicide, domestic violence, and sexual assault. The actors weren't hired carnies or park employees. They were church members, often teenagers themselves, coached to play demons, sinners, and the damned. The formula spread quickly. By the 1990s, hell houses were popping up nationwide, from Texas to Ohio, from Florida to Colorado. For many evangelical communities, they became a Halloween tradition. Inside, the House of Sin. A typical hell house unfolded like a grim morality play. Visitors were led room by room, each scene depicting a sin. A teenager overdosed on pills while her parents wept. A girl entered a clinic for an abortion, only to be dragged to hell by actors in demon masks. A man with AIDS writhed on a hospital bed, while devils mocked his suffering. Couples engaged in premarital sex, only to be murdered in car accidents, staged with bloodied props. Every scene was visceral, bloody, and deliberately shocking. Unlike carnival haunted houses, there was no humor, no absurdity, no relief. At the end of the tour, visitors were herded into the final room, hell itself. Strobe lights flashed over walls painted with flames. Church members in grotesque demon costumes screamed at guests, promising eternal torment. Smoke machines filled the air, as victims of the earlier scenes screamed from cages or writhed in fake chains. The message was unavoidable. Sin leads to hell. Then, abruptly, the lights shifted. Visitors were guided into a quiet room where a pastor or counselor waited. The only way to escape the horrors they had just witnessed while they were told was to accept Jesus Christ. The haunted house was over. The sermon had begun. Trauma as a weapon. For many children and teenagers, hell houses were devastating. Unlike monsters or ghosts, the horrors depicted were deeply personal. Abortion, suicide, sexual assault, drug use, disease. For kids who had lived through such trauma in their families, the effect was brutal. A former attendee recalled, "I was 12 when my church made us go through. They showed a girl getting raped, then dragged to hell. I had nightmares for months. I thought I was going to hell just for being scared." Another remembered, "The abortion scene was the worst. They had fake blood, screaming doctors, and demons waiting to drag the girl down. I couldn't stop shaking. I didn't sleep without a light on for a year." Psychologists criticized hell houses as emotional abuse, accusing churches of weaponizing fear to manipulate children. Critics argued that the goal wasn't entertainment at all. It was indoctrination, using shock tactics to frighten kids into religious conformity. And yet, for the churches that ran them, this was the point. Fear wasn't just a tool, it was the strategy. Franchised fear. By the late 1990s, hell houses had become so popular that some churches began selling kits and scripts for others to copy. One Texas church created the Hell House Outreach Program, offering pre-written scripts for scenes like gay wedding, drunk driver accident, and school shooting. For a fee, any church could order a blueprint for their own hell house, complete with stage directions and costume notes. This franchising made hell houses a nationwide phenomenon. Some even spread internationally, appearing in Canada and parts of Europe. What began as a homegrown Halloween alternative had become an industry of fear in the name of salvation. Controversy hell houses have been condemned for their graphic depictions of violence and their demonization of vulnerable groups. LGBTQ+ visitors, in particular, were often singled out in scenes depicting homosexuality as a direct path to hell. Suicide was portrayed not as tragedy, but as damnation. Victims of abuse were framed as sinners. Opponents called it cruelty dressed as morality. Supporters called it truth. The media latched on. Documentaries in the 2000s exposed hell houses to a wider audience, sparking debates on whether they were legitimate religious theater or psychological abuse, masquerading as ministry. Despite protests, hell houses flourished, in part because they were cheap to run. A church gymnasium, a few props, some fake blood, and volunteers in demon masks were all it took to terrify hundreds of visitors a night. Persistence. Today, hell houses still exist. Some have modernized their sets with better lighting and costumes. Others remain as raw and crude as they were in the 1980s. Guides for how to build your own hell house are still sold to churches across America. For horror historians, hell houses are significant not just as cultural curiosities, but as experiments in fear. They stripped away fantasy and replaced it with moral panic. They blurred the line between theater and sermon, between fright and indoctrination. In their way, hell houses were the bridge between old haunted attractions and the new wave of extreme haunts that would follow. Where traditional haunted houses tried to make guests scream, hell houses tried to make them break, and then rebuild them according to the church's design. legacy. For many who endured them as children, the memories remain vivid. Some recall them as nightmares disguised as Halloween. Others remember them as the moment they began to question the faith that raised them. But whether you see them as spiritual theater or psychological abuse, one thing is clear. Hell houses redefined what a haunted house could be. Not entertainment, not illusion, but weaponized fear. And from that weaponized fear came the next evolution. Haunted houses that didn't care about salvation at all, but about breaking the body and mind. Places where you weren't asked to find Jesus, only to survive. Chapter 8. Blackout Haunted House, 2009 to 2015. By the late 2000s, haunted houses had reached a crossroads. Animatronic monsters and chainsaw-wielding actors could only scare audiences for so long. Teenagers who grew up on horror films and internet shock videos wanted something darker, something that felt real. In New York City, 2 theater artists decided to give it to them. In 2009, they launched Blackout Haunted House, an attraction that stripped away everything people thought they knew about haunted houses. No vampires, no witches, no rubber skeletons. Instead, Blackout promised something far more disturbing. A journey into fear itself. The rules. Before entering, guests had to read and sign a waiver. The rules were blunt. You must go in alone. You will be touched. You may experience simulated sexual situations. You may be gagged, restrained, or forced to perform actions against your will. Visitors had to be over 18. They were warned that the experience could trigger panic attacks, seizures, or psychological distress. Safe words were provided, but quitting was considered a failure. This was not a haunted house you could laugh your way through. This was a haunted house designed to break you. Inside the Blackout, the experience varied year to year, but the themes were always the same: humiliation, control, and vulnerability. Guests were often stripped of clothing or forced into hospital gowns. They were shoved into pitch-dark corridors where masked figures whispered obscenities in their ears. Some were gagged with cloths, hands tied behind their backs. Others were forced to crawl on their knees through narrow tunnels slick with fake blood. In one infamous scene, participants were forced to put plastic bags over their heads, gasping for air until an actor ripped it away. In another, visitors were made to simulate sexual acts with mannequins, or endure violent harassment from actors screaming in their faces. There was no monster to laugh off, no cartoon ghoul to remind you it was fake. The horror was entirely human, and it was happening directly to you. Testimonies from the broken journalists and thrill seekers who braved Blackout left with shaken voices and trembling hands. One reviewer admitted, "It felt more like an assault than a haunted house. I left crying, and I couldn't stop shaking for hours." A blogger described being shoved into a closet, hands bound, while a masked figure whispered threats in his ear. "I knew it wasn't real, but my body didn't. My heart was slamming so hard I thought I'd faint." Another participant recalled the humiliation. "They made me strip down to my underwear, blindfolded me, then poured fake blood over my head. It was terrifying, not because of gore, but because I felt powerless." Many people who tapped out used the safe word within minutes. Those who lasted often emerged disoriented, sweaty, and shaken. Some swore they'd never return. Others lined up again, hungry for another descent into madness. The psychology of fear. What made Blackout so terrifying wasn't gore or jump scares. It was the theft of control. In most haunted houses, you're safe behind the invisible barrier. The actors can't touch you. At Blackout, that barrier was shattered. You weren't a spectator, you were prey. Psychologists described it as a form of exposure therapy gone wrong. By removing choice, Blackout forced participants into primal panic responses. Fight or flight wasn't theoretical, it was triggered then prolonged. The line between horror and abuse was deliberately blurred. For some, it was cathartic, a way to test their limits. For others, it was trauma disguised as entertainment. Critical reception when Blackout opened, critics were split. Some hailed it as genius, an avant-garde experiment in immersive theater. The New York Times praised it as a brutal but fascinating descent into the psychology of fear. Others blasted it as exploitation for shock's sake. Journalists who dared to enter often confessed they couldn't describe everything they endured without trembling. One reviewer wrote, "I knew it was theater, but in the moment, I thought I was going to die." Supporters called it revolutionary, dragging horror into the 21st century. Detractors called it sadism with a ticket price. But either way, no one dismissed it. Blackout wasn't forgettable. It clung to you long after you left. The spread. The success in New York led to expansions in Los Angeles and touring events. Each season, the experiences changed, growing more violent, more invasive. Tickets sold out within days. Celebrities whispered about it. Hardcore horror fans treated it as a rite of passage. But the criticism grew louder too. Some attendees reported nightmares and panic attacks that lasted for weeks. Mental health professionals warned that Blackout risked doing genuine psychological harm. By 2015, the creators shut it down. They insisted it wasn't failure. It was completion. Blackout had achieved its mission: to destroy the boundaries of what a haunted house could be. Legacy Blackout didn't just scare, it changed the landscape. It opened the door to a new category of extreme haunts, where the point wasn't to laugh and walk away, but to question how far you were willing to go. After Blackout, other haunts followed its lead. Touching became normalized. Humiliation became part of the design. Haunted houses were no longer about monsters. They were about you and your breaking point. For many, Blackout remains infamous. For others, it was a revelation. Either way, it set the stage for what came next. Haunts where touching wasn't optional, but guaranteed. Places where fear wasn't simulated, it was inflicted. And the next stop on that descent? Pittsburgh, where a basement attraction would take the lessons of Blackout and twist them into something even more intimate and even more disturbing. Chapter 9. Scarehouse Basement, Pittsburgh, 2010s. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. For years, the city's Scarehouse had been ranked among America's best haunted attractions. Lavish sets, Hollywood-quality monsters, and a reputation for pushing the envelope. But in 2013, the creators unveiled something different, something darker. It wasn't about elaborate sets or massive crowds. It was about intimacy. It was about fear you could feel on your skin. They called it the basement. The rules. Before entering the basement, guests had to sign a waiver. The rules were simple, but chilling. You must be 18 or older. You will be touched. You may be restrained, blindfolded, or separated from your group. Unlike the main Scarehouse attraction, the basement wasn't about theatrical spectacle. It was raw, stripped-down horror. Small groups, or sometimes individuals, were led into the underground space. Actors waited not behind animatronics or elaborate sets, but face to face, inches away, ready to break every rule of traditional haunted houses. Inside the basement. From the moment guests entered, the basement tore away the illusion of safety. You might be grabbed by the wrist and dragged into a pitch-black hallway. You might be shoved against a wall, a stranger's breath hot on your face. Actors whispered threats in your ear, their voices shaking with intensity. Some visitors were blindfolded and led stumbling through corridors. Others were shoved into coffins. The lids slammed shut as screams echoed in the dark. Guests reported being tied up, pushed to the floor, or forced to kneel while actors loomed over them with knives, chains, or drills. Props that felt all too real. One guest recalled, "They put a hood over my head, shoved me into a chair, and screamed in my face until I thought I was going to pass out. I knew it wasn't real, but my body didn't. Another described the coffin scene. You hear the lid slam, and it's just darkness and your own heartbeat. I panicked. I thought they weren't going to let me out. The basement specialized in personal violation. Actors stroked hair, whispered obscenities, or leaned so close their sweat dripped onto guests. It was invasive, unpredictable, and utterly unlike any haunted house before it. Fire made flesh. The basement tapped into a primal terror, the loss of bodily autonomy. Traditional haunted houses operate on the unspoken rule that you cannot be touched. That invisible barrier is what makes the jump scares fun. You scream, then laugh, because deep down, you know you're safe. The basement shattered that barrier. Once an actor grabbed your arm, the game changed. Once someone whispered in your ear or forced you into a coffin, the illusion dissolved. The fear wasn't abstract, it was physical. Guests emerged shaken, some laughing nervously, others pale and silent. A few burst into tears. Many swore they'd never return. And yet, paradoxically, some came back again and again, hungry for the adrenaline rush of controlled violation. Participant reactions to the basement were divided. Hardcore horror fans praised it as the most intense haunt they had ever experienced. One enthusiast wrote, "It's not about monsters, it's about you." The basement gets inside your head. It's terrifying and brilliant. But others were horrified. One guest accused it of crossing the line into assault. They touched me in ways that didn't feel theatrical. It felt personal. I didn't feel like an audience. I felt like a victim. Some critics argued that even with waivers, the attraction risked psychological harm. A local columnist described it as an exercise in humiliation masquerading as Halloween. Yet, despite controversy, or perhaps because of it, the basement sold out year after year. Word spread that if you wanted to truly test your courage, Pittsburgh was the place to do it. Local and national attention. The basement drew national headlines. Horror blogs ranked it among the scariest haunts in America. Local TV segments dared anchors to try it, filming their reactions as they stumbled out pale, shaken, and breathless. One Pittsburgh paper declared, "This is not your father's haunted house. This is theater designed to terrify. The coverage only fueled its mystique. People who had never considered attending a haunt now traveled across states to face the basement." The cultural shift. The basement marked a turning point in haunted attractions. After Blackout shattered the barrier of touch, the basement normalized it. For decades, the scariest haunted houses were judged by their monsters and sets. But after the basement, intensity was measured by how much actors could invade your body and mind. Touch became the new frontier of fear. Other haunts followed suit. Across America, new touch haunts emerged, each claiming to be more extreme than the last. The language of haunted houses changed. It wasn't about being startled anymore. It was about being broken. A gateway to extremes. The basement never pretended to be torture. It was still theatrical, still bound by limits. Actors weren't there to break you completely. They were there to make you believe for a moment that you could be broken. But just beyond Pittsburgh, other haunts were watching. They saw the popularity, the headlines, the way guests bragged about surviving, and they decided to push further. Because if the basement showed that people would pay to be touched, shoved, and restrained, what would happen if someone built a haunt with no boundaries at all? That question would be answered in the next chapter. In a backyard in Tennessee, one man would take the lessons of Blackout and Scarehouse Basement and twist them into the most infamous, haunted attraction in the world. Its name was McKamey Manor. Chapter 10. McKamey Manor, 2000s present. haunted houses have always promised one thing: that no matter how scared you are, you'll come out alive, laughing and relieved. But in the early 2000s, one man decided to erase that promise. His name was Russ McKamey. The origins McKamey was a Navy veteran and wedding singer living in San Diego when he began building his own haunted house. Unlike traditional attractions, his haunt wasn't about animatronics or props. It was about breaking people down. At first, it was just a hobby. A few elaborate set pieces, long nights scaring local thrill seekers. But over time, it grew darker. By the mid-2000s, McKamey Manor had a reputation as the most extreme haunt in America. When San Diego pushed back, McKamey relocated to Tennessee, where the show became even more notorious. The waiver. To enter McKamey Manor, guests must sign a 40-page waiver. It includes chilling clauses. You may be bound and gagged. You may be submerged in water. You may have your head shaved. You may be force-fed or forced to ingest unknown substances. You may leave with cuts, bruises, or broken bones. Before signing, participants must provide a doctor's note, proof of medical insurance, and pass a background check. Only then can they attempt the tour, but few ever finish it. Inside the manor. The McKamey Manor experience is unlike any haunted house on Earth. There are no monsters, no props, no escape rooms. Instead, guests are kidnapped, restrained, and brutalized by actors for hours on end. Participants are dragged through mud pits, submerged in icy water, and locked in freezers. They are bound in straitjackets, force-fed foul substances, and covered in insects. Some have been waterboarded. Others have had teeth pulled or hair ripped out. The entire ordeal is filmed by Russ himself, who edits the footage into highlight reels uploaded to YouTube. In these videos, participants scream, vomit, and sob uncontrollably, begging to quit, while Russ laughs behind the camera, reminding them they signed the waiver. Contestants broken. Almost no one has ever completed McKamey Manor's full tour. The manor is designed not to scare, but to exhaust, humiliate, and break. One participant recalled, "I thought I was going to die. They held my head underwater until I couldn't breathe. I was crying, begging. It wasn't fun, it was torture." Another said, "They shaved my head, slapped me, shoved disgusting things in my mouth. I felt like an animal videos confirmed the intensity. Grown men screaming, women sobbing, people writhing in mud, restrained, shaking uncontrollably." Unlike other extreme haunts, McKamey doesn't hide what it is. Russ has said openly, "This is survival horror. It's a game of endurance. If you can handle it, you'll make it through. But most people can't." Russ McKamey. Showman or sadist? Russ presents himself as a ringmaster, a man obsessed with fear as art. He insists participants know what they're signing up for, and that no real harm is intended. But critics paint a darker picture. They argue McKamey enjoys the suffering too much, lingering on the tears, the panic, the begging. Some former employees have accused him of cruelty beyond even the waivers. Is McKamey Manor art, or is it exploitation, torture porn with paperwork to make it legal? Public backlash. As McKamey Manor grew infamous, backlash exploded. Petitions circulated to shut it down, calling it abuse, disguised as entertainment. Neighbors complained about screaming in the night. Mental health advocates warned that it caused lasting trauma. Russ dismissed the criticism, calling his haunt a reality show. He even claimed there was a $20,000 prize for anyone who finished the tour, though no one ever has. For many, that only added to the suspicion that the manor wasn't a haunted house at all, but a sadistic endurance contest. The cultural debate. McKamey Manor is the final frontier of haunted attractions. To some, it's the logical evolution of a culture obsessed with extremity. After Blackout in the basement, this was the endpoint. Pure survival horror. To others, it's not a haunted house at all. It's a loophole that allows one man to inflict suffering on willing participants under the guise of entertainment. What began in Vienna with illusions of an upside-down room had become this: Americans crawling through mud, sobbing bound and broken while cameras rolled. Legacy McKamey Manor remains one of the most controversial attractions in the world. For some, it's the ultimate badge of courage. For others, it's evidence that haunted houses have gone too far, that they've left horror behind and crossed into abuse. But whether you admire it or despise it, one fact is undeniable. McKamey Manor changed the conversation. It showed that fear doesn't need monsters or ghosts. All it needs is control, humiliation, and the willingness of people to pay for their own torment. From illusions that flipped a room upside down in 1894, to a haunted house that films you begging for mercy in the 21st century, the haunted house has completed its transformation. And with McKamey Manor, the line between theater and torture has disappeared completely.
From Vienna's upside-down room to the blood-soaked halls of McKamey Manor, haunted houses have never been just tricks of light and sound. They are mirrors, reflecting our fears, our obsessions, and sometimes our cruelty. From tapes of the lost, we wish you a very happy Halloween.